The Hangout is on air, live. Okay, theme music.
You are charged with capital
Oh, yeah.
anti-citizen possession
Woohoo! Sorry, that never gets old. Okay, welcome everybody. I am joined.
The Hangout is on air.
Oh shit!
Live.
I keep forgetting that bit. I'm a terrible radio show host. All right. As I was saying, welcome. This is Anti-Citizen X with Meditations on Proof. And joined with me, as always, is Charkopoulos, my lovely assistant. And today's discussion is really inspired by that common, what do you call it, that trope where you'll hear a Christian say something like, you can't prove that God doesn't exist, you silly atheist you, or there's no good arguments that atheism is accurate and correct, right? You've probably heard those claims. You've heard those claims, right?
Oh, yeah, I've heard those, and I cringe every time.
I cringe a lot too. And it's even more cringing when you hear kind of your fellow secularists and atheists getting on board with it. One of my favorite ideas is what they call lack theism, where you say, I'm not really saying God doesn't exist, I'm just saying I lack a belief that he exists, which is, one of those very, how do you describe, hesitant and wimpy ways of coming about the issue, because there's lots of perfectly good justifications for the proposition God does not exist. And we're just going to go over a large list of ways you can positively prove definitively that statement.
Or tentatively, as the case may be.
Or tentatively. Well, positively prove it, and within, the maximum limits that nature and philosophy will allow. How does that sound?
Sounds good to me.
Okay.
And I like proofs as being your friendly local neighborhood mathematician. That's what I do.
Right, and this is really the central theme of our discussion, is to ask, what is a proof, quote unquote? What does it mean to prove a proposition? Because people really seem to only have this very narrow-minded concept of what a proof is. That you're only allowed to positively prove something if it fits the qualifications of like what you'd expect from a mathematical theorem. And that is the only proof in the universe that exists. But
it isn't.
It's not. There are different levels of proof, strictly speaking. And so we're just going to kind of go over them and ask, what does it mean to prove? What are examples of how you could positively prove a proposition? So let's kind of do a quick overview here.
Sure.
I kind of divide them up into three broad categories. And each category has like little subcategories in it that we'll find. But when you really stop and think about it, there's more than one way to skin a cat. There's more than one way to prove different types of propositions. And I guess before getting into that, this is kind of a psychological bias I see a lot in people, Christians, atheists alike, where they look at truth and knowledge as this just binary thing, that here is some proposition, it's either true or it isn't, and then just all propositions are created equal and should therefore just be treated the same. And
you're on shaky ground there.
Yeah, like knowledge is kind of a tiered process, I like to say. There's different types of propositions we care about and different ways of justifying the truth of different categories. So, for example, let's start with the absolute simplest form of proof there is, which I just call proof by admission. Right?
Okay, explain your proof by admission.
Okay, so let's suppose you get arrested for a crime, for murder, and you go before the judge, and he says, do you plead guilty or not guilty? And you plead guilty. I'm guilty, Your Honor. Okay, the trial's over. The prosecution's job is now finished. There's nothing to argue. We're all in mutual agreement that you're guilty of murder.
There you go. Fair enough.
The situation is over. So I don't have to argue points that we already agree on. And we can, you might call that sort of a weak type of proof, but it's still important to acknowledge that if we're in mutual agreement on a proposition, then there's nothing left to argue. I have no burden to prove anything to you. We're done. We agree. Let's move on. And so, and we'll find as we talk about this, like there are plenty of instances where Christians themselves are admitting, either implicitly or explicitly, that God doesn't exist. So we'll talk about that in a bit, but let's just keep taxonomizing or categorizing these proof categories.
Sure. So simply the easiest proof is by admission, where you don't even have to actually argue. That's not even. It's almost not a proof.
But it kind of is in a sense. I mean, you don't necessarily think of it as a proof in the strictest sense, but I've heard the expression used before, a proof by admission.
No, yeah, it's fairly. It's fair to say. It's just there's not much more to it. It's a trivial proof, I want to say.
Right, and that's a perfectly valid. It's very trivial, but like I said, we'll see examples of how it really is applicable in real world discussions over matters of religion and God.
Okay, so beyond the trivial, what do we have?
Now we have the slightly less trivial, which still actually is technically somewhat trivial when you think about it. But I'm just going to call these the second category like analytic proof, or maybe you can call it like a proof by deduction. And this is the kind of proof you would find in your standard mathematical logic type understanding of what a word proof might mean. But
so deductive proofs. They're not. Many of them are not trivial, I might add.
Oh, yes and no. By trivial, I mean they don't actually say anything about objective reality. They only talk strictly about the interrelationship between ideas. Like if I say, Tim is a bachelor, premise 1. Premise 2, all bachelors are unmarried. Premise 3, therefore Tim is unmarried. That is an absolutely solid proof by logical deduction. But all I fundamentally said at the end of the day is bachelors are defined as things that aren't married, and Tim is not one of them. Like, if we define bachelor this way and accept that Tim is bachelor, then by the sheer interrelationship of those words and definitions, other propositions essentially follow.
Sure.
So, like I said, they're not trivial in the strictly speaking sense, but they are trivial in the sense that they only really relate to the interplay between words and ideas. That is the realm of propositional logic.
That's fair to say. I'm just saying you're getting close to my little home base of study of mathematics to say that blanket statement that it's trivial. Come on.
I'm sorry. Mathematics is very important to the world. It's not trivial.
It's important.
It's important.
Okay, so let's connect this to connecting it to how a god may or may not exist. How might this be used deductively?
Well, I'm getting to that in a second. I was going to first say there's like multiple categories of proof by
Mm-hmm.
deduction. The most intuitive sense is the idea of I can just logically derive a theorem from axioms. That's the literal definition of a proof in the context of mathematical logic.
Oh, sure.
But another similar one that's not really acknowledged quite so often is, what if I can just show that the words you're using don't even have any meaning? Like if I were to ask you, do blargles exist?
Do blargles exist?
Yeah.
Only when they blark the blargles in blargledom?
That question has no answer. Like, I haven't defined what a blargle is. And if I told you a blargle is something that snargles with the tribbles on alternating Fears days, I'm spewing out syllables at you, but I haven't fundamentally said anything.
In the month of Smarch, right.
Yeah, in the month of Smarch. So, like I said, this is why I don't really say they're all proof by deduction. I think a better word is like an analytic type proof, where just the meaning of the words hasn't cohered into anything. And this is a problem with the concept of God in many instances, where people think they sort of know what God is, but when you try and just pin them down to coherent definitions, they don't say anything meaningful.
Oh, yeah.
So I can't even assign a truth value to incoherent propositions. So it's not even false. It's like worse than false. It's babble, right?
Well,
So-
yeah, that goes
yeah.
right back to shaky ground of saying all propositions are equal. They
Yeah,
need to
exactly.
be coherent first in order to be even considered what kind of ranking they have. And a lot of people don't take that into consideration. It's rather sad.
Yeah, exactly. Like, again, it has to first qualify as a meaningful proposition before I can even start throwing truth values at it. If you can't even meet that little hump, then of course God would not be a thing that exists because you're not even talking about a well-defined concept.
Yeah, it's fair enough to say that someone comes up to you and says, "Hey, God exists," and then you say, "Oh, so is that God over there?" They say, "Well, no." Okay, well, what over there? Well, no. Well, how do I know one when I see it?
You can't, but it exists anyway because reasons. So I maybe go back to the courtroom analogy. Do you plead guilty or not guilty? And if I say smidgen, smidgen, Your Honor, and you'll be like, I don't know what that means. I can't work with that.
Exactly.
Okay, so that's our second category, sort of analytic proofs, where we have kind of the coherence issues, and then just flat out, contradictory theorem type proofs.
Yeah, so at least if you have a definition, then that's something that you could at least logically work with.
Yeah. So
Logically?
logically, yes, you can logically work with coherent propositions that have truth values to them. But if you can't even get to that step, but anyway, let's move on. Part 3 will be. I wish I had a better name for this. I want to say maybe like proof by abduction, or maybe inference to the best explanation, or maybe I can just call it a synthetic proof, proof by synthesis. I really don't know what a good proper name for this is, but I do know a good legal definition that's actually very fitting. And when you're on a jury in a courtroom, you don't actually prove the defendant's guilty. What you would do is a proof in that legal sense means a justifiable conclusion that is supported by the evidence beyond any reasonable doubt. That's the key phrase there. It's a supportable position, but given the evidence, and there's no reasonable excuse you can come up with to think otherwise.
Preponderance of the evidence.
That's the word I was looking for. It's a justifiable conclusion derived from a preponderance of evidence beyond a reasonable doubt. So this is, if I were to say, prove to me that Bigfoot exists, and I just drag a bloated carcass of a hairy ape thing and dump it on your desk, that would qualify as a proof, right? Would that be convincing to you? And I said, there, that's Bigfoot.
Point.
Right. It's not a mathematical proof. It's not a theorem. I've just shown you the evidence. And we would call that a proof in any reasonable legal or scientific context. Just there's the thing. You point your finger, that's Bigfoot. There, you see it exists.
And look how big its feet are.
Exactly. So that's sort of our third category of proof. And there's a lot of subcategories in there. Like you have the idea of falsifiability, you have probabilistic arguments, and issues of the null hypothesis, and so on. Or even Occam's razor is a way of disproving things. That if I have two equally valid explanations and one is just better, then the other will just default to that one and consider it done.
Sure.
So why not? So those are the major taxonomic categories of what a proof might look like. And so what I'd really like to do in this discussion is just really kind of go through them and give examples of how we can say confidently God does not exist in accordance with every single one of these categories.
Okay, so this isn't just a lesson on different kinds of proofs given different kinds of postulates, but it's but no, God doesn't exist in every conceivable category. Okay.
Right, exactly. This is what we're going to do. Every single categorical way of proving something, we can prove that God is not a thing that exists.
Tentatively.
Well, depends on the category. Some
Sure.
are absolutely certain, and some are the tentative scientific categories. But just because it's tentative doesn't mean you can't call it a proof.
No.
If I have video evidence and DNA of some guy raping and killing a person in a courtroom, yes, I could argue philosophical skepticism that I don't really know for sure that the guy is guilty, but come on. Like that's justification. We would say the proof is there. That you've proven that case.
I would just love to hear a lawyer say that, though. But yeah, okay. So, okay, sure. So,
Oh, that'd be great. You have the Matrix defense.
come on, Your Honor.
Oh no, like sure you've got the video evidence and you got the DNA and maybe as a written confession, but how do you know for sure that those things are real? How do you know they weren't just fabricated out of the Matrix? You can't know for sure. Maybe aliens just, came down to Earth and planted that evidence there to frame my claim. You can't prove that's not the case, right?
I think that's preponderance of the evidence beyond any reasonable doubt.
Exactly, and that's what is intended by reasonable doubt. I mean, you could go to a courtroom and say aliens made me do it, and that would be a philosophically viable hypothesis, but nobody's going to take that as an excuse.
And note how lawyers and the United States judicial system has already taken that consideration into account and said we don't want to bother with that.
Yeah, like that's not a legal defense. I mean, it's philosophically correct that we can't disprove the aliens, and the prosecution would have this burden of proof showing that aliens didn't force you to do it, but like that's just not a reasonable argument anymore. You're just grasping at philosophical, metaphysical straws.
Yeah.
So that's where the reasonable doubt comes in, where all things being equal, this is a perfectly viable explanation, and I don't have to postulate wild and fantastic things anymore. But I digress. We're getting ahead of ourselves here.
Yeah.
So let's start with
the trivial proof by admission.
Proof by admission. So if I were to go to a Mormon and just say, hey, what is God to you? Their answer will be kind of interesting. They'll say God is an exalted being who was once like a man but went through life and got a physical body and has now been exalted into a perfect being and then has created spirit children of his own with his own planets, and that's where our relationship is to him. And he rules over us from planet Kolob, and he has a physical body of flesh and bone and everything. That is essentially the Mormon concept of God.
That's the nutshell version, yeah.
So you just go to a typical Catholic, and he says, what are you, nuts? That's not what God is. God is the Trinitarian concept. I assert that God is, in fact, the three-in-one entity of Jesus Christ, the Holy Ghost, and the Father, and you put them all together, and now I've got the Trinity. And that Trinitarian concept, that's what God is, and that's the thing that exists. Because if that exists, your Mormon thing doesn't exist. Those are incompatible things. Then you go to the Muslim, and he says, what are you, nuts? That's polytheism. God is just God. He's not this committee thingy that you're talking about, this three-in-one. He's just God. And maybe Jesus Christ was more of a prophet or a messenger, and the Holy Ghost is this subordinate thing, but God's God. And that's the thing that exists, not your thing.
Mm-hmm.
Then, of course, you go to the Hindu, and he says, you're all wrong. God is the guy, the purple elephant-headed thing with 6 arms.
Ganesh.
Ganesh, that's right. And he's like, that God on planet Kolob? No, God is Ganesh.
That's it. Done.
Yeah. Yeah, and so the mere fact that you believe in some concept of God, as a Catholic or a Christian or a Mormon or a Muslim or a Pentecostal or Hindu, you are necessarily rejecting the existence of other God concepts. The Mormons are rejecting the Muslim God, the Catholics are rejecting the Mormon, and the Hindus are rejecting the Catholics. Everybody is mutually rejecting the existence of all these other gods. So when you ask a Catholic, does the Mormon God exist? His answer is no. The Catholic is atheistic with respect to the Mormon God. He will say that God is a thing that doesn't exist. It only exists in fantasy, in fiction, in the minds of the believers.
With absolute certainty, one might say.
He'll be perfectly confident, and maybe he's right. Maybe that Catholic God is, in fact, the correct version. But that still doesn't save you from the fact that if that God exists, other gods don't. all of them reject the existence of Thor and Loki and Odin. So it's not just the atheist saying God doesn't exist. It's everybody who's ever believed in some religion in history is also making that claim. So if I were to go to a Catholic and say, does the Mormon God exist? His answer will be no. And then I, as an atheist, will say, thank you. I totally agree. That thing doesn't exist. We don't even have to put it on the table. It's not an argument anymore. That God does not exist.
Done.
Done. So this is the famous quote where, like, as an atheist, I agree with everybody that everybody else's gods don't exist. The only thing we aren't really in agreement about is your particular God. But everybody else in the world who isn't your religion agrees with me that that thing totally doesn't exist. So this is a category of proof by admission. I don't even have to argue with the Muslims about the Catholic God. I don't have to argue with the Mormons about Ganesh. We totally agree. We all are embracing hands and singing Kumbaya. Hooray, Ganesh doesn't exist.
Do you suppose that places atheists in some kind of coupled majority with the rest of the world?
In a sense, yeah. It's like really the only difference between me and a Catholic is the Catholic God in particular is the only one we're in disagreement about.
Mm-hmm.
But let's acknowledge the key point that we totally agree that those other gods don't exist. They're not real things. We totally agree. It is a proof by admission. We don't have to argue that point with each other. So in that sense,
if you're looking at me to argue that, I'm not going to say anything.
It's fine. I'm just giving you a chance to chime in with any sort of personal thoughts. But I mean, this is not a trivial observation. I mean, we call it a trivial proof, but it's really not a trivial thing to point out. That there's nothing to argue.
Absolutely. We see it happen in the world every day.
Mm-hmm. So, you know, when some Pentecostal or evangelical apologist comes along and says, you can't prove God doesn't exist, it's like, you're the one already claiming that. Right? We already agree that at least some gods aren't real. It's really just your God that we have this issue with.
Uh-huh.
So there's our first category, proof by admission that God doesn't exist. Now, what's another example of how we might see this? I see this a lot with Christians because I hang out with Christians a lot and I have to engage with them a lot. I don't really encounter this with as many Muslims because I don't understand their doctrine and I don't talk with them very often. But in order to be a Christian, that means you've basically read the Bible, you understand the doctrines, and especially you understand the teachings of Jesus Christ as detailed in the New Testament. So one of my favorite examples is that bit where Jesus says unilaterally, it is easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. He says it flat out. Wealth is totally antithetical to the plan of salvation. Material worldly possessions. Now, if I was a Christian and I genuinely believed the reality and divinity of the Bible, that passage would terrify me. I would be selling everything I have and living as modest a life as I can. I would be essentially like Gandhi, living in just enough to survive.
Like any monk or priest that just lives at the church.
Yeah, exactly. Like this was a common thing, I assume, during medieval eras with monasteries, where they went out of their way to live very modest lifestyles. They just had
to live a life of piety. Absolutely.
Yeah. So I don't see this in modern conservative Christians, especially in America. I mean, yeah, you kind of occasionally have that really nice guy, maybe some doctor every now and then goes to Uganda and does some Doctors Without Borders stuff, but the vast overwhelming majority of them are materialistic assholes. I mean, there are probably dozens of more examples we could drum up of this. Like, Jesus is also big on turning the other cheek. And I can guarantee you, many average Christians, if you just antagonize them, will be more than happy to get into fisticuffs with you. Like, you're not a Christian if this is how you act. So there's a difference between what you say you believe and what your actions reflect. So if your actions don't reflect the fundamental teachings of Christianity, then I'm sorry, you aren't a Christian. Even you don't believe what you profess to believe. So by mere actions alone, we have another form of proof by admission, that if a Christian isn't willing to follow the teachings of Christ in the Bible to the letter, then he's not a Christian. Even he or she doesn't really believe the things that they say they do. Like another great example is in Leviticus. If a man lies with another man, it's an abomination. Therefore, gays are icky and no gay marriage. Well, you're like, yeah, but it also has that other stuff about eating shellfish and killing your disobedient children, and there's stuff about how women during their menstruation cycles are unclean too. Yeah, and lots of things are abominations back there in the Old Testament.
Lots of fun little things to really keep an eye out for if you're really going to follow the Bible to the letter.
Right. So that picking and choosing this is again a form of admission that they aren't really trying to believe their own doctrine. They're just picking out the bits they like and ignoring the ones they don't like. Which is again a form of admission that they don't really believe what they claim they believe.
It's belief by convenience, I think, is what I'd like to call it.
So these are two categories of proof by admission, where just your actions and your own words justify the statement, well, God doesn't really exist. You don't really believe that such a thing exists. And we agree. We're in total...
Yeah, and if you don't believe, I'm not going to bother even trying.
Exactly. So that concludes our first form of proof by admission. We don't even have to argue anymore. It's just, okay, we agree. That's not a thing. Let's move on. So let's go to our second category of proof. This is proof by analysis. I kind of like the sound of that. So the strongest form of proof by analysis, I think, is just the raw incoherence of God. So my personal favorite, you go to a typical Christian, say, define God for me. Describe what such a being is like. And they very typically will say God is spaceless, timeless, and immaterial. What do those words mean to you?
I don't know.
Exactly. He's not in space, okay? He's not in time, and he's not made of anything. So you've told me some things that he's not. But what is he really? And honestly, when you...
Something to not coalesce into any material form at any time ever sounds exactly like something that doesn't exist. That's the only
exactly. That description is logically equivalent to nothing at all. You just said God is nowhere, does nothing, and isn't made of anything. How is that different from nothing at all?
Which they stopped right there, but then they say,
no,
and God did all this stuff.
Yeah, and yet he still interacts in space and time and is dynamic. And so, I mean, the description of God is equivalent to nothing at all. He is nowhere. He's spaceless, timeless, immaterial. He is nowhere, does nothing, and he's not made of anything. So, okay, you just said God is effectively nothing at all. So this is a form of kind of incoherence to what God is. You've said what he's not. If I ever ask you what's a cat, well, you say it's not a bird, it's not a mountain, and it's not the sky. Yeah, but what's a cat? Can you point out a cat to me? Point your finger at a physical, empirical thing and say cat to me.
I already pointed out the sky. God.
I mean, is it the set of everything that isn't the sky? No, it's just a thing that isn't the sky. And it's not a dog, and it's not my shoe. Okay, you haven't described anything yet. What are we even talking about? The way you identify a thing like a cat is you point to the damn thing. You grab a cat, say, here, this is a cat. This is what it looks like. These are its properties.
Not to get on a tangent, but when you try and actually point out these kind of problems, when people start getting upset at you for not basically following their script,
yeah,
of just how quickly people can get mean.
Oh yeah, That's a totally separate discussion, actually, is the condescension of apologetics. Ask me about that in the future, and we can do a whole meditation just on that particular topic.
Okay, I will. That's okay.
So that's the basis for atheism, essentially. When people talk about God, they aren't even talking about a coherent thing. Like the Trinity concept is another great example. What is God? They're like, well, there's the Father, there's the Son, and there's the Holy Ghost. Okay, which one of them is God? Like, none of them's God, but they all are. So when they all get together in a committee and start making decisions together, that's God. God is the committee of the three, and they're like, no, God is a single person comprised of three people called the Trinity.
Yeah. That's just, there's always that ongoing joke, if you come across a Catholic, if you really want to make them stumble over their own words, that's all you have to do, explain the Trinity.
Uh-huh.
Please explain the Trinity for me.
It's like it's three, but it's one. Only there's three of them in one, and it's God. Shut up. So that's another great example. So this is the basis for ichtheism. It's just when you say the word God, I don't even know what the hell you're talking about. You're babbling incoherent gibberish at me that doesn't even cohere into a meaningful concept. I don't even know what to do with these ideas because they're just so jumbled.
Yeah, and on top of that, if you can't even define what you're trying to defend, then there, buddy, you better step back for a second.
Even you don't really know either. Yeah. So the second category of a deductive proof will just be flat-out contradictions. So my personal favorite, as everybody knows, is the omnipotence paradox. Like, they define God as a being that can do anything, or all that's logically possible. And you're just like, okay, can God stand before a podium and truthfully state the words, I am not God? And they're like, no, he can't. But you're like, that's a thing that he's supposed to be able to do. It's a thing. It's logically possible. And they're like, yes, but no, but shut up. Meh. And so just logically speaking,
there's one of anything to be done, but you're saying that cannot be. Really, that's a bad contradiction.
Yeah. So just that definition creates false statements. It creates internal contradictions logically. You can just follow the definitions and doing just basic analysis, and you just arrive at flat-out contradictions. Like, to say that he can or he can't do all that's logically possible, it's false either way. You can't have it. Self-referential statements necessarily create contradictions that can't be true either way. This is just the nature of propositions. You have to be careful with your definitions.
Yeah, if the definition doesn't make sense, don't expect it to logically go anywhere.
Yeah.
That's fair enough to say.
So the omnipotence paradox is kind of an obscure one, and not many people find it terribly convincing. And that's to be fair, because you have to go deep into freaking liars' paradoxes and self-referential universal sets and blah blah blah, and most people don't even really understand that. So it's a contradiction that's there, but it's like this big complicated analysis to get to the conclusion.
It's not a common contradiction, but it is a contradiction.
Yeah, and if you're careful about defining omnipotence, okay, you can kind of avoid it. But in Christianity, there's even more blatant contradictions than that. For example, God is omnipotent. Okay, God can do all sorts of great things. He's all powerful. But then it also says in the Bible, God can't lie. Like, really? You just can't say words that are not true.
The most powerful being ever conceived, and cannot do that simple thing. Yeah.
And there are examples in the Bible itself where God basically flat out lies, like with Abraham, where he just says, I want you to kill your son. Like, Tee-hee. And then he's like, no, psych, just kidding, I was only testing you. Like, well, I'm sorry, you had to withhold that information from him. You had to tell him something that was not exactly true.
That wasn't being honest. Is that lying? It's definitely being dishonest.
Well, or maybe you could say, well, he just commanded, Abraham, go kill your son. No, wait, stop. I mean, is that technically lying or just jerking somebody around a bit?
It's testing someone by jerking them around.
But I'm sure if you look through the Bible, there are probably instances where he definitely says something that just isn't true. But the Abraham example is kind of just a close example of that. But you don't get to say God's omnipotent and then God can't lie. or that God never gets tired. I think that's in the Bible, somewhere like Isaiah. Like God is just doesn't get tired. He never tires. And then there's bits where it just says God rested and got tired on like the seventh day. Like they're just not compatible things. Or of course in the New Testament, how many angels were there at the tomb? Well, was it one or was it two or zero? Or was it two guys in white? Like all the accounts just completely conflict with each other.
It's starting to sound like the problem with the Bible is the Bible.
Yeah. So there are definite contradictions all over the place in the Bible, and just in the very idea of God himself. So I'm sorry, guys, but you can't have it both ways. You can't tell me that God, you can't believe in a thing that's internally inconsistent. I'm sorry. That doesn't logically work. I got my notes here. My personal favorite here, the plan of salvation, is God created us as imperfect things with free will, so that we started sinning, and so therefore he had to send us to hell infinitely for our finite crimes of sinning. And in order to overcome that desire to punish us infinitely, he sent himself to die for us in the form of Jesus, who was really a part of God, and then he sacrificed Jesus, because sacrificing suddenly means he can forgive us for things, because all you had to do is kill a guy, and now that's justice for all the masturbation that you did, and then now, bam, you can come back to heaven. Like, that's a bit of a confused way of saying it, but I mean, it's effectively the entire plan of salvation is this convoluted, illogical mess of nonsense.
So you're saying, wait, I'm going to go to hell for something I didn't do, but for something my great.
Well, that depends on who you talk to. Some Christians will say, yes, you sort of inherit the sins of your father. Other Christians will say, no, it's just you have your own sins, and the mere fact that you masturbated once in your life means you now deserve infinite hell.
God damn it.
Right. So the infinite punishment for finite crimes is just another blatant contradiction. You don't get to say God is benevolent and merciful and just, yet will torture you for eternity because you had a dirty thought about a girl.
Yeah, that doesn't sound very just to me.
Or just, you were 8 years old and you told that one little lie, like, did you eat any ice cream before I told you to? No. Fuck you liar. Off to hell. Yeah.
That's it. First straw, you're out of here.
Yeah, like one little itty-bitty smidge. This is an actual Christian doctrine. The slightest little smidgen taint of sin automatically means you're now imperfect, you can't be in the presence of God, and it's just off to the hellfire with you. And the only way to around this is because God had to now send Jesus and just had to put him on the cross and then kill him. And like now this makes it all better for some crazy reason.
But you're still not out of it.
All right, and then you have to now accept that sacrifice somehow.
Even though it was already done on my behalf.
You have to now believe that all this happened without question, or else it doesn't apply to you, or something.
Wait, what?
Yes. So this is another one of my just favorite arguments against just God and religious beliefs as a whole. Is just the sheer nonsensicality of it all. It just doesn't cohere in anything that makes any meaningful sense. And it's just this wonderful mental gymnastic on apologists to try and explain it. So there you go. Those are perfectly valid ways to prove that God is not a thing that exists. It's just the very idea itself is either inconsistent or just incoherent.
That's fine. Oh, which I gotta point out here, when I do talk to apologists, I just love setting them up for doing whatever kind of religious gymnastics they need to do in order to, however they need to justify whatever they're trying to say.
Yeah. So that basically concludes what a proof by deduction would be, an analytic style proof. Just the idea of God fails to cohere in anything consistent or meaningful, and therefore just axiomatically can't be a thing that exists. It's either just axiomatically false or just not even false, just gibberish.
Yeah, but I would say as far as existence of things, I'm segueing here.
Yeah. Thank you, segue dude.
Segue. If you're going to start talking about existence, well, okay, so we fall, I believe, on the other side of our synthetic and analytic distinction.
Well, that's what we're getting to. Let's suppose finally some Christian pulls his head out of his ass and derives a coherent definition for what God is and what his properties are.
Comes
And-
up with actually a coherent definition. Okay.
Yes, so he just says God is a being of immense power who created the universe and will judge us for our moral behaviors after we die and punish us accordingly. That's a
Okay.
perfectly consistent definition. And most people, theists and non-theists alike, if they were just presented with such a being, would more or less say, okay, that kind of fits what we think of when we think of the word God, right?
Sure.
So all of a sudden they just completely bypassed all the analytic disproofs. We now have this coherent God concept.
Simply the being that does some judging after you die, if there is a whole after-death thing.
Yes, just assume there's an afterlife, and if there is, this is what this being will do. And now we have this coherent list of properties. And if you just knocked on your door tomorrow and said, "Hello, how you doing? I'm powerful. I made the universe. I'm going to judge you," and demonstrated those claims reasonably, like you'd be like, "Okay, I guess you're God. I will just call you God for now." Right? Now, obviously, we don't have God or any being of that equivalent approximation knocking on our doors. So what's the next best thing? Well, first and foremost, that's just a definition. Okay, you've coherently defined God. I can't axiomatically disprove him, but so what? You just defined a word for me. Whoop-de-fucking-do, right?
Yeah, that still comes back to, I could say, here, look at that Blorgelschnap, and point to an apple. You'll say, apple? I say Blorgelschnap? Oh, okay. I
could say
still need to
triple.
take the God thing and connect it to something in reality.
Yeah, or not even just, suppose I define to you the word tribble as a small, hairy mammalian rodent, generally spherical in shape. It's born pregnant and it hates Klingons. That's a great definition, isn't it?
Oh, yeah, and coherent.
Yeah, it's perfectly coherent. Be like, yeah, that thing you saw in Star Trek, they're kind of like that. Do they exist? No, I just defined a word. Here is a word, and here are the list of properties we associate with that word. So what? So our first argument is essentially the null hypothesis, and there's different ways of framing this. The first and simple one is basic probability. Just take the set of all things that you can imagine to be real. Just write them all down. Like unicorns, leprechauns, Bigfoots, whales, and Jupiter planets, and stars, and black holes, and blah, just list crap. Okay, some of them are probably real, and some of them probably aren't. But take the list, count everything that probably exists in objective reality, and count everything that doesn't exist in objective reality, and weigh those two lists. Which one is bigger than the other, do you think?
Well, you asked me to count all conceivable things.
Uh-huh.
I think I can give you a mathematical proof that there are infinitely many such things.
Infinitely many such definable things or non-existent things.
Oh, it has to exist? Oh, well, that constricts it.
Right. So, right, by default, the set of all things that have existed or will exist is going to be a finite list. And the set of all things that might be real is a hell of a lot bigger. Probably infinitely bigger. Right? You could even mathematically prove that, I imagine.
I can.
Just take a rhinoceros. This is a typical rhinoceros with one horn. Well, imagine a rhinoceros with 2 horns, now 3 horns, now 70 horns. All right, there's this now infinite list of variations on the rhinoceros. There's infinitely many more
I thought of that.
on the rhinoceros than there are actual rhinoceri in the world.
Well, then what you do is you also make up beasts. You can make up chimera beasts like the rhinoceros eagle,
Uh-huh.
and then adding horns.
And then add horns and fangs and feathers and different colors.
And the moment you can start counting appendages, well,
Yeah.
go on to an arithmetic affinity, and you're good to go.
Right, so it's pretty safe to say, for all practical purposes, the set of all things that might be real is infinitely greater than the set of all things that are real.
Very safe to say.
So if I were to just hand you a definition, here is a being with properties X, Y, and Z, that simple fact alone, by sheer rote probability in the absence of any other conditionals, the probability of that thing existing is I guess we could say it's identically zero, isn't it? Not quite zero, effectively zero.
Well,
That's an interesting. Would it identically be zero, or would it just be
no, you're.
zero?
I'm going to start spewing out measure theory, and
It's like a differential step away from zero. We'll just say the odds are one in a gajillion.
No, you have a set of measure zero, and you're not in. Yes, it's essentially zero. We'll just leave it.
Really, really tiny, right? Well, okay, so just by rote probability alone, the mere fact that all I have to go on is you defined a concept for God. Whoop-de-doo for you. Probabilistically, whatever your concept is, it probably doesn't exist. Given that
infinite things, your probability is zero.
Yes. We can say it's the unconditional probability. Now we can change matters by saying, well, if that thing exists, then in principle I should be able to point to it and handle a specimen, in which case now we have kind of the Bigfoot problem. Okay, if I dump Bigfoot's carcass on you, what is the probability of Bigfoot's existence given that I just dumped a carcass on your desk that satisfies all the definitional properties of Bigfoot? That's now a conditional probability.
Proof of Bigfoot? What is the evidence that Bigfoot exists? Yeah, okay, so, or does Bigfoot exist given proof of Bigfoot? Yeah.
Yes, what's the probability of Bigfoot exist given here's the specimen that satisfies all the definitional properties of Bigfoot?
Yeah. That's
kind of the opposite extreme now. Basically one. Barring that I'm faking it somehow or mistaken in some far-reaching.
Well, surely you will allow me to medically examine the specimen.
Yeah, exactly.
Of course, yes. Yes.
But the probability is now different because I've given you more than just a word.
Absolutely, more stuff is happening there.
So I like to say, this is a proof by just probability. And it represents a form of null hypothesis. Just that by default, when you just come to me with some idea of a thing that may reflect reality, it's probably wrong. Just by sheer rote probability. The burden of proof is on you to show me that it's more than just a definition, a word that you made up. So this is the burden of proof problem. Like, just by default, I am justified in asserting, yeah, that thing probably doesn't exist. And in fact, the probability is so overwhelming to be effectively certain, maybe not perfectly certain in the mathematical theorem sense, but you can quantify your certainty in a form of probability as almost effectively absolute, just not quite. I mean, that's still good enough to say, yeah, I'm pretty confident that thing doesn't exist. There are no proofs.
Here we are again at a preponderance of evidence.
Exactly. Your preponderance of evidence is you defined what the concept is.
Yeah, and you give me your concept, I look around, and I point at everything I can point at, and nothing I point at matches the description for your definition. Well, there you go.
Well, don't even look around. I mean, just the sheer given fact that all you have to go on is I've defined what a tribble is to you, that information alone does not mean tribbles exist. No. And I justifiably claim that if that is all we have to go on, then the sheer probability of them not existing is effectively certain.
Yeah.
And we can then conditionalize it even further by saying if tribbles exist, then in principle I ought to be able to find a tribble and handle one and examine it myself. And then if I go out and attempt to find tribbles and fail to find one, what does that do for the probabilities?
Yeah, it is a logical implication of something's existence.
Yes. Logically speaking, if it exists, I should be able to experience it somehow. And if I go out and I still can't experience for my best efforts at trying to experience it, then, Well, essentially, that's what falsifiability is. Well, thank you, segue, sir.
Da-da-da.
So our first synthetic proof, or proof by abduction, is just the rote probability. You come to me and define what God is. God is a being with X, Y, Z properties. Okay, whoop-de-doo. It still doesn't exist. I can confidently conclude that by rote probability if that is all the information we have to go on.
But my thing I just defined exists. It's part of the definition. It has to.
Now we're getting to bare assertions. We'll get to that later. But that's actually an interesting philosophical point. Can I just define existence as a property of the thing? Most people don't really find that convincing, I'm sure.
That is a property of a thing. It is not a definition of a thing. Shut up.
But now we get to the problem of falsifiability. So, okay, you've defined God, and all right, I still can say it's a thing that doesn't exist. But then you've gone out of the way to say that, well, God is a being that created the world and designed it with very specific purposes and intentions in mind. He's absolutely perfect, and he's benevolent. So then that begs the question, what the hell is smallpox doing in our world? What about all that polio and those little worms that embed themselves in your eyeballs? And there's horrible things in the world that cause suffering for no apparent reason.
Many horrible things where the only thing they do as a mechanism of survival is to bring you pain and misery.
Yes. Exactly. I think smallpox is my personal favorite. Like, why does smallpox exist? It is a virus that does nothing except reproduce at the expense of human well-being. And now that smallpox is gone, everybody in the world seems happier for it and better off. Fancy that.
Every day I wake up saying, yay, I have no smallpox.
Right. So the mere fact that smallpox existed is logically inconsistent with the concept of a omnipotent and omnibenevolent being, a being that wants to maximize happiness and well-being in our world, has the know-how to do it, and the perfect capability to bring it about, didn't.
Yeah.
And the best that Christians will say is, well, maybe it logically couldn't have been any other way. As if, seriously, like, if God had just removed smallpox from the world, then somehow that would have been a net detriment to all the well-being and suffering of humanity. And all I can think is, like, fuck you. What planet are you from? Cancer.
I haven't come across smallpox lately, but smallpox I know.
I mean, you still have polio and malaria. Why are we even bothering to remove malaria from the world if apparently this is the maximally logical possible well-being the universe is capable of attaining?
Yeah, why are we even bothering with disease at all?
Yeah.
It's the best world to live in possible.
Right. So, again, the idea of God makes testable predictions. If God is a being that, with these properties, then we should expect the world to have these properties. And we go out in the world and we look around and we're like, it doesn't have those properties. That's the essence of a scientific falsification. You've made predictions, they failed to come about. Therefore, your model, your description of the world is false. It's wrong. Therefore, your God doesn't exist. And that is that's a logically certain thing. At best, you can insert ad hoc hypotheses, but now you're changing the model into something else. But given that pure, simple model, that concept of God can't be a real thing.
No. At best, something is horribly missing from your model.
Yes.
First, you really shouldn't even begun with that. You should have, considered the ramifications before you brought it to me.
Yes.
Or you. Wouldn't be nice about it.
Yeah. So this is the essence of, now we've got the null hypothesis coupled with falsifiability. By default, you hand me this concept, it's not a real thing. But on worse than that, the concept of God makes predictions that don't come to pass. So now it's even more wrong. It's like the probability was already skewed against it. You just made it worse. It's even lower. It was already like differentially stepped away from zero. You just like, how do you like split a differential probability into something even less?
They found a way. They found a way.
They found a way. Oh god. So I mean, what's another great example? We'll use like Mormons. We'll pick on Mormons again. They state flat out, if you read the Book of Mormon and then ask God with a sincere heart and faith in Christ, God will just manifest the truth of His reality and existence to you on the spot. And like there are thousands of Mormons around the world who've tried that exact experiment and got bupkis. Right? So the
hard,
predictions,
of course.
those are like try harder. And I'm sorry, like you're wrong. You made a prediction that failed. Therefore, your description, your model of a thing that exists is false. God's not a thing that's real, as you've described. Sorry. That's just the logical conclusion given the evidence.
Yeah. Maybe there is another one where again, you have to be little more plastic with, I guess, how much effort you have to go into searching. But then you didn't say that at the beginning, so I shouldn't expect it at the end.
Now, in defense, you have sort of the agnostic position. We'll just say maybe you didn't try hard enough, or maybe you didn't pray hard enough, or maybe God has a perfectly good reason for letting millions of people suffer and die at smallpox and polio and malaria. We just don't really understand His ways. And that's one of those claims. It's philosophically correct. Yes, we live in a world where we don't have absolutely perfect perception of objective reality.
Did you just go for the mysterious ways?
Yeah, the mysterious ways defense. So just because the evidence doesn't quite work out, that doesn't absolutely logically certainly prove that God doesn't exist. It just means maybe we don't quite understand things enough. So therefore, the correct position is not atheism, but agnosticism. And this is one of those defenses that I just want to punch people in the face because it's so abjectly stupid. Because the thing is, it's technically correct, but it trivially applies to literally everything. Like, prove to me that the president exists. You can say, well, there's the guy on the screen there. Who's the president? I'll say, that's just a guy on a screen. How do I know he's the president? Maybe he's an actor. Maybe it's an elaborate hoax. You can't prove that to me. And they'll be like, well, let's go to the White House. And be like, well, I shook some guy's hand. And he had a pin that said president. And he was in the White House, but maybe the president was off in Russia, for all I know. Maybe there is no president, and it's just a hoax. I'm in the Matrix. Like, these are not arguments. These are just ad hoc hypotheses, for starters, and they're just appeals to external world skepticism. And you start falling to the problem of beyond a reasonable doubt now. These are totally unreasonable doubts. Right? Go ahead.
Oh no, just unreasonable. Again, when you try to throw away all reason, like you do know the road you're going down, people. Yeah. When you start just going, when people start asking if you left your tinfoil hat at home, you've gone beyond a reasonable doubt.
Yes. So this is why I can't stand people who argue for agnosticism, is because you're just not thinking this through. Like, it's one of those things that's technically correct, but it's also true for literally everything. So bringing it up as a distinction in this context is meaningless.
That's a philosophical position. I have to agree with you. It's technically the one everybody should be taking about this position here. But we live in a world that is not absent of evidence of things, where we don't have to go on the abject say-so of things. We have evidence of things in this universe. We have an idea of what's going on.
Well, it's more than that. I mean, you can't be absolutely certain about any synthetic proposition. And if I say, prove to me that planet Earth exists, you can't technically do that with absolute certainty. You can show me evidence and give me a reasonable conclusion given that evidence, but that doesn't absolutely prove logically that Earth is a thing in objective reality.
Well, yeah, that's why science has to always hold a tentative position on everything it understands.
All right, and that's just a basic fact of synthetic propositions. And when you're talking about that world beyond your immediate mental awareness, nothing is perfectly certain. You just have these models of reality that you build, and then you use them to kind of make decisions, and those decisions either work out predictably or they don't. Then you modify your model accordingly, and that's how science is essentially done. And this is how we understand mind-independent reality. So
Well, there you go. I would ask, why is it people have not done this with their God?
right, and this is the thing that I hate about agnosticism, because it's only an issue with God when it technically applies to anything and everything. Like, you literally can't prove that your own mother exists if this is the road you're going to go down. At best, you have a preponderance of evidence that justifies a conclusion, but that's not a logical deduction. so I'm sorry, like you can't have that. It's safe to say you've proven things given a reasonable preponderance of evidence. I'm sorry, that qualifies as a proof in the realm of science and synthetic propositions. Get over it. Okay? So that's my rant against agnostics. We can justifiably say God does not exist. And that's, as best as we can prove that statement within the context of synthetic propositions.
Oh, and I would say it's also good to point out that it's the you don't know that my God doesn't exist. You can't say that's wrong.
Or yeah, maybe he's hiding out on planet Kolob in Andromeda somewhere.
Yeah, were it not for our understanding of psychology as we know today.
Oh, okay. Thank you, segue, dude. So yeah, moving from the agnostic position, kind of a final proof, I think someone actually left a comment. Newton's lightsaber. Yeah, somebody left the statement. Newton's lightsaber, or I guess more correctly is Occam's razor. When people go on about God, we know where religion comes from. Like, science is at the point where it's finally beginning to construct a very rigorous theory of religion itself. Like, where religion comes from, why people believe it, how religions develop and progress over time, and what they're going to do in the future, and what factors govern the beliefs that people hold. So when you're left with these explanations of the world, how did the universe get here? Why do so many people believe in God? And what is about the fine-tuning? Well, we have better explanations for this stuff than God did it.
Yeah.
And especially explanations for why you believe in God in the first place, as a matter of human psychology.
Again, back to what we said in the beginning, lots of different people believe in lots of different gods.
So obviously, that's a great point. So obviously, it seems perfectly normal for people to believe in fantastic supernatural crap. This is just a given about human nature.
So what makes humans special?
So this brings us about to kind of like the Jesus on a toast problem, where someone will say, "Oh, look, it's my toast and it's burnt and there's a Virgin Mary on it." And what's the better explanation? That Jesus just felt compelled to stamp his mother's image into the burnt toast crust, or that maybe people have a tendency to see things that aren't there.
Isn't that pareidolia?
Pareidolia, yeah. So one of these things we have no reproducible examples of, and the other we can generate on command. So to me, this is kind of the final argument about God not existing, is just the problem of we know why people believe in the first place, we know why they're so compelled to, and the evidence they tend to bring has natural explanations that are far more compelling, far more simple, require fewer assumptions, and are coherent and reproducible.
Yeah, and not to mention here, the model of our universe of the God does not exist model works pretty darn well.
Yeah, so that's a great example of like what's more likely, that God is this omnibenevolent, omnipotent, omniscient being that absolutely wants to maximize human well-being, yet despite of that created smallpox and hookworms and cancer, and but that's okay because he has a perfectly good reason for inflicting us all with pain and misery and death and disease and suffering, because it's all part of his master plan for not having pain and misery and death and suffering. Or we just live in a world with mean shit in it and God doesn't exist and isn't influencing us. Which one of these explanations requires less explanation, fewer assumptions?
Oh yeah, and not to mention, it's one of my favorite quotes out of science by Laplace.
Uh, oh, go on.
Oh yeah, when Laplace figured out perturbation theory to explain how the orbits of all the planets didn't collide in on themselves.
Where's your God factor, sir?
Well, that's exactly what Napoleon asked. Where is God in this? And Laplace gets to nicely respond in his emperor. You know, good sir, I had no need of that hypothesis.
Exactly. So this is kind of the ultimate nail in the coffin, is the concept of God at the end of the day just doesn't do anything. It doesn't allow me to make any predictions. It's not repeatable or demonstrable, or there's no empirical reference for it. Like, I just don't know what you're talking about, and I can't predict anything through that concept that I couldn't do otherwise. So, yes, God as a concept is essentially defeated through Occam's razor. The world is just simpler and easier to explain and manage and predict when you just assume that God isn't there doing things in it. Like, I'm sorry.
Everything actually makes more sense.
Yeah. Okay, you got cancer. What are you going to do? You're going to go pray it away, or are you going to go to a doctor and get chemo? Which of these decisions are you going to stick to?
Mm-hmm.
You know, in the moment you decide not to pray it away, you're effectively admitting that that God model has no value. It's not doing anything. It's not guiding any decisions for you.
Even though it's right there in the Bible, all things through prayer, right?
Right. So that more or less wraps up our discussion on how we can prove God does not exist from any conceivable angle you can think of, and why agnosticism just isn't a viable position. It's not like maybe or maybe not the being that created the universe is hiding out on planet Kolob twiddling his thumbs, and we just haven't flown spaceships there yet. I mean, there's the null hypothesis coupled with definite falsifiabilities contained within the concept of God.
Sure. And until that changes, until God is sitting right there saying, "Hi, I'm God,"
Yeah. Then what is the reasonable conclusion based on the current preponderance of empirical data?
that God does not exist. Done.
No, wait. Say that again. Say that again.
That God does not exist. Done.
All right, on that note, let's take a look at some of our questions. We'll do a quickie Q&A if anybody has some little bits they'd like us to answer here. So what do we got here? Jenny, sir. Oh, come on now. Oh, come on. You don't know about how presuppositional Christians argue. They can prove anything because of God, and they know that because God has revealed it to them, so they cannot be wrong. And if you try to disprove it, you already admitted to God because you do logic to need God. Oh, God, yes.
Oh, God, yes.
Yeah, God exists, therefore God exists. Well, if you get to just
logic, therefore God exists. No! Shut up!
if you get to just assume flat out that God is a thing that exists, I get to do the opposite. God is not a thing that exists. And that proposition is axiomatically true because I say so. Fuck you. Now what? I can play that game too. And then, of course, to say you need God just to do logic is like, do you even know what logic is? It's like saying you need the Bible to play chess. Like, that doesn't even follow in any coherent way. They're just trying to, I don't know, it's when the evidence doesn't agree with them, they just argue epistemology instead.
Well, you don't know what you know. Well, then you don't either, and sorry, that's it.
Okay, Jiao Sturza says, favorite comic book? Go.
Ooh, you first.
My favorite comic growing up was Gru the Wanderer. Imbecilic, death-crazed barbarian who, bless his heart, just wanted to find work and help people and just accidentally killed them every time. It was great. What was your favorite? I remember you were a big X-Men guy.
I was definitely into X-Men. Well, I got into many Marvel things.
Uh-huh.
X-Men was definitely top of the cake there. Yeah, I'll have to say X-Men. Uncanny. Good old uncanny X-Men.
The agnostic, Squig Sky Tower says the apologetic about smallpox is so we learn about how to make vaccines. Not saying it's good.
Hundreds of millions of people now dead from smallpox.
Yeah, so God is just like, these humans here, they're just, they need to learn to make vaccine. I'm just going to afflict them with a virus, and so it'll hurt a little bit, it'll scar them, but it'll be for their own good, so they learn how to make a vaccine against this virus that I'm afflicting them. It's like, this is a self-creating problem. What's the word for that? It's a racket. It's basically God is saying, I'm going to afflict you with a malady because you need to learn how to cure yourself of the malady that I'm afflicting you with.
Yeah.
Or you could have just not invented smallpox and we wouldn't be up this creek. I mean...
And again, tell that to the hundreds of millions of people who have died needlessly from smallpox.
It's just like, sorry, God's trying to teach us a lesson. We're not really sure what it is yet, but...
maybe in 1,000 years we'll have this whole vaccine thing figured out.
Meanwhile, have some blankets. So yeah, the arguments against the problem of evil are just absurd. We could do a whole hangout on just the problem of evil, I think. That'll be fun.
Oh, here we go. Janny, sir. Oh, it's to you, Anti-Citizen X.
Okay. What does he say?
How come you don't know about presuppositional?
We just read that one.
Oh, crap.
Let's do one more before we finish.
Okay. This whole scene thing.
Let's see. Mute. There we go. Let's see. Dear ACX, why do you think Europe is collectively more secular than the U.S.? Do you think it's because of the competition in the U.S., whereas lots of countries in Europe had state religions? Dear James Tate, I have no fucking clue. That is actually a very good question, because historically Europe was kind of the seat of Christianity, and now Europeans are just not terribly religious people. And that's a great question for sociologists and psychologists, which I'm not. I'm sorry. And on that note, do you have any final remarks before we finish?
Coming from a mathematician's point of view, that is what I did. I studied logic and applied it to math.
Yes.
I really wish other people would take a little more time and learn logic.
Especially, like what logic is and how it works, because...
Especially if you want to make logical arguments, and if you want, whether you wanted to defend your God or you want to say God does not exist, whatever position you want to take, please learn what logic is so that you can form a cogent argument. That's all I ask.
Yeah, or that you can at least recognize a bad argument when you're making it. That's another one of my biggest pet peeves, is people just abusing logic. Like, you're not studying the logic enough, and it's like, do you even know what that word means? Like, that doesn't prove that God doesn't exist. You're kind of like, well, maybe not in that absolute mathematical sense, but so what? Like, there's different levels of proof.
Mathematical sense, and that's that. Yeah.
Yeah. So I hope you all enjoyed our discussion. So the basic take-home point is there's more than one way to skin a cat, and there's more than one way to prove a proposition. So proof by admission, we've seen how God pretty much fails on that level. Proof by analysis and deduction, again, God failed there. Then we had proof by abduction and synthesis, and we've seen God fails in that category as well. So the idea is unsound, Christians themselves admit it, and the concept has no pragmatic predictive value. And on that note, thank you all for tuning in. Have a good night.